Welcome into another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
I'm your other host, James Rejecsic, and today we're going to be just discussing with the two of us two core concepts in Summoner Wars related to space. A lot of our discussion normally talks about what you should discard for Magic. The name of the podcast, it's the hand management and the card choices and which cards are good, which should be played in this matchup, which should be used here. But the game, it still has that two-dimensional aspect to it that is really core to the way it plays. And there are two terms that I defined back in first edition when I was talking about Summoner Wars, and I want to reintroduce them today, talk about them a bit, and we'll go back and forth between them and discussing what those terms are. So the first is one that I call crowding, and crowding is like controlling space by taking up space. You put something on the front of somebody's gate, and then they can't summon there. You put 2 more units or 3 more units all around that gate, and suddenly they can't summon at all, even without destroying that gate. So crowding is about taking up space. It's not just about crowding up gates, it can also be crowding units so they can't move in the directions you don't want them to move. And then zoning, on the other end, is about controlling the game through negative space in terms of like using your range to your advantage. Like if you have using your maximum distance for your ranged attacks. And it's also the idea that different characters are going to have different ideal ranges to be at, how to control space that way. So that's crowding and zoning.
Yeah, and I think a couple of different things that have come up in the community fall into those different like platforms of under the broad thing of zoning, you'll have like the donkey stack, which has been a popular thing that's gone throughout the community of lining up all your units. We can get more into that when we talk about zoning, but in a stack to prevent taking away some of that negative space and prevent your opponent from having a good way to approach you.
So maybe we'll talk about crowding first. You know, the first example I gave was to take the front gate spot. It's something that a lot of people just talk about. We're like, oh yeah, that's good to do that. And we don't really think about why that is. You know, but if you take up that front gate spot, that's one less summoning spot they have. But not only that, but it's a summoning spot that influences a lot of the middle of the board. By crowding that, you know, you can take away options that your opponent has. But like I talk about crowding stuff with units, but you can also crowd them with gates as well or other structures. You know, if you put a gate on someone else's spot or where they want to do stuff, it takes away some of their options. Even further, we talked about donkey stack. It's actually a mixture of zoning and crowding because the old way of talking about a zoning donkey stack was using your opponent's gate as cover is how he first phrased it. So it's like you put something up against someone's gate. That's a crowding thing. And then after that, it's blocking that whole zone behind that gate, if that makes any sense.
No, for sure. Almost even in the same aspect of like a donkey stack, you don't even always have to be fully in front of your opponent's gate to use these techniques. Like I find myself often staying in certain lanes and then forcing them to play a unit like in front of their gate or approach from the front of their gate where the rest of their units are not able to help out and support. And it leaves that unit vulnerable to a counterattack.
Because often, if something has to come out to attack you, then you could attack it from 2 or 3 sides. Or you could like back up further and use your range. You know, that's a zoning aspect. Use your full range to attack the thing that came out. And then they're spread out even further.
And some factions can do this a lot better than others. Like Cave Goblins, for example, are very good at crowding. They have a lot of tools to crowd, whether it's clingers or like climbers or like their events like sneak. Those give them a lot of movement and abilities to place things around gates, in front of gates, crowd your opponent, shut down that space, and not allow them to use that to their advantage.
I've talked a lot about crowding of, you know, structures and gates in those summon spots, but units can be crowded as well. Oftentimes, if you surround an opponent's summoner, then they can't move it, you know? I was looking through and thinking about it, and there's actually a lot of summoner abilities and other unit abilities that trigger after movement. If you look at something like Svara's Structural Shift, or Abuashi's Spirit Bond, abilities like that require you to move actually get shut down when you just surround the summoner. So sometimes you might not even attack the summoner yet. You might surround them and then destroy surrounding units. But you're crowding that summoner to prevent them from being able to move on a subsequent turn.
And there's even certain points where you want to crowd your own summoner or different aspects of that because of the fact of like I've seen high level players who use Savara very aggressively early in a game, close to the end of the game, almost shut her off completely, sometimes do shut her off completely, limiting that space because they're playing against an aggressive faction that can hit back, and they just want to make sure that their summoner doesn't die because they think they're ahead on econ, and so like they might shut Savara off completely and wall her in a quarter or something of that aspect, or wall off multiple sides. I saw Orange Lazarus do this in a recent game where he had Savara more in the midfield, but walled off on 3 different sides and was doing very well in that game because he was so far ahead in econ, and he was just worried about that aspect.
Another thing to think about too is that crowding can look different depending on what faction you're facing. Think about you're facing like the Forged or the Wayfarers, who can do things on their diagonals. Sometimes blocking off the 3 or 4 cardinal directions isn't enough. You might want to instead cover Celeste, the diagonals behind her and the space behind her so that she can't slip by out. That's important too, because sometimes when Celeste dives too deeply, it's important to seal off her escape routes.
Yeah, and trapping a summoner once they get deep into enemy territory is one of the easiest ways to win a game, even if it's a game that you don't think you have a chance of winning otherwise. If the summoner gets over aggressive, I've had games myself where I've gotten just a little too far up. Something you want to be careful of if you're playing a very aggressive faction is if you get past that back 3 rows, they can just place a structure behind you, and then the rest of walling you off becomes a whole lot more easy. Or if they get a unit behind you, if they have like the mobility to do that. A lot of factions who could be very ahead, like whether it's Mountain Vargath or Tundra Orcs, but they can be very aggressive, and their summoner might be on the other side of the board, can lose games that they should be winning based off getting trapped by the opponent.
General rule, it's very dangerous to go into your opponent's back 2 rows unless you're going to seal the game, especially against factions that have even more structures to place, like your Logic factions or even like the Wayfarers who can place a waypoint behind you or something. And obviously like the factions with extra gates like the Swamp Orcs and the Avians. So we can bounce back to zoning to inform the discussion a bit more. The main idea I think that I had with zoning is that it kind of came from fighting games that are 2-dimensional, where you can jump or move left or right. So they're 2-dimensional in a different way, and they often fire projectiles at each other. And it's about finding the right amount of space to use your character the most effectively. Advancing, and sometimes they'll, something like Balzar or Celeste are actually what I would consider good zoning characters too, or zoning factions, because Balzar, when he has enough boosts, he can blow up anything within a 4-space radius on his next turn, is what I'm saying, because he can move up to 2 spaces and then Volcanic Blast. So you have to be conscious of leaving anything within 4 spaces of him unless you use your own crowding techniques to block off his advance. Similarly, Celeste, if you have Gusto or a Slip By, you can get almost anywhere on the board, especially with a waypoint or something like that. That's why when we were talking about the alternate strategies for Wayfarers, we often talk about keeping Celeste in her back couple rows, because she doesn't need to be in the opponent's side to actually threaten the opponent's side, thanks to all of her events that let her move so far.
Yeah, and another one I think that has a very similar aspect to those two is the Swamp Orcs with Muglug, because you don't have that ranged attack, but you have reach, and so you have to be very conscious of the amount of space that you're keeping away from your opponent. You want it to be enough space that they have to approach you and get them a little off balance, but you don't want it to be too much space that Muglug can't be used to attack, because that's your primary and almost only source of damage in that deck.
On the other end, like the people that really just want to play keep away, you've got factions like the Sand Goblins, where sometime your turn as a pure zoning turn, you might do something like have a Rentrat attack the opponent while next to your gate, attack, and then immediately rig explosives under the gate. So you just do a little poke and wait, and you're playing this little footsie, this little range zoning game to keep the game going and try to avoid taking an activity damage yourself while forcing your opponent into an awkward position. Sand Goblins are one of those factions that can really punish people coming onto their side or even anywhere near their side thanks to silts. Once you have more magic, it becomes a lot more dangerous to advance against the Sand Goblins.
Yeah, and Sand Goblins also have a couple very interesting zoning abilities with like thrusters, especially late game, and carry as well. That whereas you can use a lot of negative space to prevent your opponent from approaching or to get away from your opponent after you shoot like ranged with Crust and thrust out of there, that in the end game, especially when you're running out of options with your deck, it's very hard to counter for most decks in the game. having like Sparks and Krusk in that end game can be a very devastating effect to your opponent, especially if they both have thrusters.
They can block for each other, and also it's often common to put a thruster on a gate itself, so you might shoot at max range or something, shoot at something, and then put a gate in front of yourself, and that in changing your own line of sight, the line of sight to your summoner or whatever's behind the gate, that's a zoning technique as well. Is it kind of will change what's possible to attack. That might make you vulnerable to your gate being crowded or something like that, but you have to keep in mind, sand goblins are much less vulnerable to most crowding techniques because they can place their structures on their side of the board, their unit structures on their side of the board.
Yeah, and so a lot of these techniques are very faction dependent on like what you're able to do and what aspects you can pull from them. Some more than others, and what faction you're playing also plays into it a lot. Like if you're playing Tundra Orcs versus Cave Goblins, you might not be able to crowd as much as you would normally as Tundra Orcs, which are a faction that can get very aggressive and get up there and crowd. But Cave Goblins with their horde might prevent you from doing that because they're crowding you in their own aspect.
There are some interesting tools there too. Freeze is a very funny one against the Cave Goblins, for example, and it kind of just seals off the board, so it's sort of a zoning technique there. And also, I think another interesting one is just like Primal Fury becomes really good. It's another thing that people have to be aware of when you're moving Grognak or your own summoner, to be worried about what might happen after a Primal Fury. Blocking a summoner off isn't necessarily going to be safe enough against, if the unit has like 3 or less health, Grognak can easily Primal Fury through. And also, they've got one of the units with Far Shot, which you can keep in mind. The amount of distance that Targon can fire from, as well as your other units in the game that have Far Shot, definitely. You want to use that full 4-space range when you can.
There's some factions for zoning that do a lot in a lot of different ways. For example, Phoenix Elves are a faction that are very good at zoning. They can like take away that space by bringing units back to Maldaria, but they also have their events that allow you to sort of force your opponent into certain areas, certain zones with Divine Ret and with Blinding Flare to really make your opponent play a certain way or attack certain things.
Yeah.
Zoning them to certain areas.
Counter to Phoenix Elves when they're doing that kind of stuff, playing those events, is like, well, I'll just attack their gates. But I've seen Pursewarren and some other players play the Phoenix Elves a little more aggressively and actually put their own units in front of their gates, so you don't have the option of hitting a gate, So sometimes you're just stuck attacking into double Spirit of the Phoenix Divine Retribution or just taking an inactivity damage, and I feel like sometimes the inactivity damage might be the right play, but it feels bad to not attack any units that are threatening you.
Yep.
We talked about the Wayfarers in their zoning ability to like hang back and still be able to affect lots of parts on the board potentially with their threat. But they also are one of the best factions at stealing spaces, and that's a crowding technique. So things like the Gem Dancers being able to dance into a gate spot, Celeste using Slip By to get to a spot, or Boldo getting into a spot after he attacks, or after someone else kills that unit and then he agiles into the space. So stealing spaces is a very powerful aspect of crowding. Even though we talked about Cave Goblins being a primary crowding faction, they don't do that much space stealing. But that's one of the things that makes Tundra Orc fighters really good, is they can steal spaces if you roll the Frenzy. Spectral Conclave is a great faction for crowding people with their ability to summon during their turn and force during their attack phase and stuff like that. However, they're very awkward in general, I'd say, to play against when it comes to zoning and crowding, because they create all these little landmines on the board, essentially, and that if you move next to this, you're giving them a free boost, which will mean that illusion will come back stronger than ever.
Yeah, they are an interesting faction. I think that does very well in both the crowding aspects with the amount of illusions they can get out there and the amount of space they can take away with the abilities that those illusions have.
And Mind Mage, Mind Mage is obviously a big zoning character too, in terms of the ability to they could summon a Mind Mage somewhere, and if they can get to my summoner or something that's adjacent to my summoner, a common, you have to be very worried about them taking away your units for the turn and hitting you with them.
They're also really good at zoning though, because of the fact that they have all those abilities to feint back, and also the depart ability, which creates all this space that you can't really attack their units unless you have ranged attacks. So for melee factions, they are very good at zoning different areas out.
Yeah, I agree. There's also units like that either force you to attack them or reduce your strength. Things like Stupefy and Protect, those create areas on the board that are less good for your units to be in. So it's kind of a zoning thing, but if you think of like a Citadel Knight on your front of your gate, it's also crowding you at the same time while also reducing your options that way. So it's a bit of both.
And there's also like, I don't know if offensive zoning is the way to say it, but there are some factions that are very good at putting your opponent where you want them with abilities, whether it's like the Breakers using push abilities or blast or hypnotic, or zoning you out with Tempest or control, greater push. They have a lot of abilities that allow you to put your opponent where you want it, but there's also like lesser known aspects of like Guilford. Guilford can bully you into a spot, putting you in the zone he wants you to be in. And there's also several knights and different units that shove, which are another ability to do a similar thing, but slightly lesser extent.
Yeah, Breakers really excel at zoning. That's their whole thing. Calls them in Street Fighter or something like that. Like keeping the opponent at bay as long as they can and then teleporting around. You brought up pushing things, wind mages and other things to push them where you want them to be to hit them again. But you can also, like with Kalal, she can push something at a melee unit at max range one more space back so that she can't even get hit back in melee.
Which can be brutal and makes her very strong.
Especially like in the end game situations against like Tundra Orcs or something that might not have as many ranged options to deal with there.
Yep.
I wonder if we should go through the different factions and talk about whether they excel at crowding or zoning and in what ways. I know we've already kind of touched on a lot of factions.
Sure. Let's do it.
We said Breakers are like a pure zoning faction, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
With their counterparts, the Cave Goblins being more of a crowding faction. Think about controlling the space with your guys, rather than...
Yeah, and one of the aspects for like Cave Goblins that makes them a really good crowding faction that we haven't touched on is the fact that despite being pressed up with their summoner sneaks, he can always get out of there because of his ability, as long as he doesn't die, obviously, that turn. Because he has a sly ability, even if he gets up and gets crowded, like shut off by your opponent because he's in those back 3 rows, it doesn't affect him at all.
He can always get out. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So then the rest of the master set, I guess the next two would be like Polar Dwarves and Savannah Elves.
And Polar Dwarves are an interesting one because they have majority of people play them mostly just as a zoning faction, but they, like we talked about in the unconventional playstyles, if you use them more aggressively, they can crowd very, very well.
And use structures to do so.
But most people don't use them to crowd, they just use them to zone areas with like parapets and like keep the range and then clean stuff up with glacial shifts and ice rams and stuff.
Yeah, I'd agree that they're a mix. Savannah Elves, I'd kind of put in similar to the Breakers category, I'd say, and that with units like the Border Archers and stuff, they're really going to most of the time lean on their range units and their zoning game, I guess. I mean, they have rhinos and they have other stuff, but usually you don't have enough magic to summon enough units to be crowding your opponent that effectively, I'd say.
Yeah.
But again, it's kind of a zoning. Even the rhinos, I think, are kind of a zoning unit. You get a bunch of boosts on them. It affects where you can attack, what your threat ranges are. But you're still not probably going to be trying to cut off your opponent's movement options entirely, I'd say. Then we get to the last two. We got the Fallen Kingdom and the Vanguards thematically. They're both weird. I mean, I guess the Fallen Kingdom, it's a question of staying out of the zone that they can create with Blood Summon. You have to be conscious of how far they can go. And sometimes it's not so much getting 8 spaces away or whatever the distance is to prevent them from blood summoning you. It's to use your own things to cut off zones, your own units, your own gates, things like that to block off the zones that they can get to through blood summon, I'd say.
Yeah. And I feel like the Fallen Kingdom does an interesting aspect of zoning because they are zoning to a degree, but they're zoning not in the fact that they're staying back and trying to use all that negative space. They're trying to use the negative space more in like the midfield and push you to attack like their carriers in certain areas. Sometimes it's a bit crowding also because sometimes you're up against gates, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're just like only have the carriers in front and you're just trying to force your opponent to just approach them instead so you can get more carriers out. And using those different aspects, the Fallen Kingdom does really poorly against factions that can zone really well because of the fact that they struggle sometimes with the approach of different factions without blood summon to help them out if they can't find it.
The Vanguards, I lean towards them being more of a zoning faction just because it's all about using Sarah Eldwin's ability to trigger as many times as you can. So you want to get into a situation where you're hitting stuff with Sarah and she's a ranged unit, and you want to try to create zones where the Citadel Knights are protecting you, but not necessarily blocking off all your opponent's summoning spots, you know? And you've got Renewed Hope, protect yourself, and get multiple attacks down a lane or something like that. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
No, I think that's accurate. And Sarah's an interesting one because sometimes you like when factions get up and try and crowd you a little bit because you have that aspect of Renewed Hope you can still summon off of. And like some of the other factions that we'll get to in a little bit, Sarah loves to attack. And if you get a unit that's in her back row or like way back in her area, then that push forward unit will probably not be able to attack her because of the Citadel Knight going next to it. But also she'll get some free attacks on it and get to clean it up and get some Citadel Knights back.
Next up was the starter set. I'd say if you had to like simplify it, you'd probably say Phoenix Elves are more of a zoning faction and the Tundra Orcs are more crowding. They do have aspects of both in terms of like target allowing you to play a range zone if you want to with the Tundra Orcs, at least kind of like a hint at one. An aggressive Moldaria can also be moving forward and then hit something and then put a Guardian in your face or an Ember Beast or something like that that'll actually cut down your options that way. So it's like I've seen people crowd gates with Moldaria sometimes too. It can work.
Her summoning abilities help her with that also. They can also clear spots around gates fairly easily with like Wildfire and the different direct damage abilities. So there's definitely aspects. Moldaria tends towards zoning and has a lot of tools for zoning, and I think Grognak, like you said, tends towards crowding, but they both definitely have the ability to do the opposite when played a certain way. Maybe a bit more unconventional in those aspects, but they definitely have the tools to do that too.
The next two were the birds and the cloaks. Skyspear Avians and the cloaks. This kind of comes down to the playing style choice with the Avians, at least, I think, where we were talking before about we weren't sure which was the true playing style or the conventional one. Is it hanging back and using your ranged, or flying forward and using gates to protect Ava, or block their gates with your gates? I think Ava is pretty dynamic and flexible in that regard. If I'm going to like try to make a silly like sweeping rule, I bet a lot of air factions like the Breakers and the Avians can usually play a good zoning game, though. Talk a bit about the cloaks.
The Cloaks, I feel like they're a faction where they do a lot of zoning with gunners and like moto boots, and they have that ability. But the entire time they're zoning, they're just waiting for their moment to crowd you without a shadows.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that moment they crowd you without a shadows and Vlox gets like a full health Vlox or like pretty high health Vlox gets right up next to you, and you're like, well, this game changed a lot.
And often on the turn, you get that Auto Shadows. You don't necessarily win on the Auto Shadows turn. You destroyed the units nearby, and you surrounded their summoner, so that their summoner is crowded and stuck, and you're like, oh, well, I guess I die next turn. Especially against someone like Savar or somebody who might want to be able to move around a little bit to move her structures, or like Buashi might be stuck and unable to boost even on his next turn. It could be a very frustrating way to lose, but they use the zone and play footsie to get that takedown with the crowding. I'd agree. And the last two in that wave, I'll let you take the Fungal Dwarves since that's kind of your favorite.
Fungal Dwarves tend to be more of a zoning faction for the most part. They're more of zoning in the aspect of the Fallen Kingdom, though. They're trying to create certain zones where they can get more infects in, and so how you place your gates can really affect this because you don't want a ton of people to have a bunch of ways to attack you on multiple sides. So normally you want like 2 spaces in between your gates, but you do want the ability to attack your opponents on multiple sides, so you want to get those units around those gates. But lately I've been playing Fungal Dwarves a lot crowding more than I've been playing the zoning aspect, and I've just been playing the fast and furious, the full throttle Fungal Dwarves, just pushing forward with Koldak, getting aggressive with Stim Shrooms, getting up there with like Release the Spores and Gates, and taking away those aspects. And they have some abilities to do that crowding too, whether it's infecting or Release the Spores or Stim Shrooms to get that extra space. But for the most part, they are played more as a zoning faction.
Yeah, and I'd probably say the same broadly for the Eternal Council as well, who's the next one in this pair. Edia can hit at max range, and you'll often want to hit at max range, and then use a Citadel Advisor to push her further away, or use Mind Knights to control spaces, or create zones where you don't want your opponent to move, or to shove stuff into a spot. Edia can hit them. What can change the matchup a bit is what events you steal can change the way you play. If you steal Unrelenting or something like that, you might want to then get more aggressive and just say you force your opponent to try to take them out. Or similarly for something like Renewed Hope, one of the Savannah elves, the Chant of Weaving, then you can just start getting in their face and being more aggressive. But in general, I'd say you want to keep back with the Eternal Council. And then the next two are the original Fast and Furious factions, being the Sand Goblins and the Obsidian Dwarves. I'm going to say broadly they're both more zoning factions. Sand Goblins can kind of play keep away and stuff, like I was saying with that Wrench Rat trick, just to chip damage, hang back. I mean, with Rust Riders and other stuff, you can kind of move forward and play more aggressively, and the Bug Biters are often used to kind of get a pin or like to slow down the enemy, get behind the summoner so they can get stuck. So they can play in a little of both, I guess, even though they don't have great ranged options aside from their summoner and Uncle Sparks. When it comes to Obsidian Dwarves, I'd say they have that aggressive zone I was talking about, like, because I don't usually actually try to block many gates as much with Obsidian Dwarves or even pin the opponents. More like I'm going to slowly advance and corner you in. I'm going to create this area that's very inhospitable for you, and I'm going to keep moving that slowly closer, But ultimately, you got to keep Balzar safe, and you do that by attacking at range and also putting Ember Guards in front of you to cut off those line of sight.
Yeah, and especially with Obsidian Dwarves, there's a lot, and against, I guess, Sand Goblins too, there's a lot of aspects when playing against them where you have to be very conscious of the zoning that you're doing, because if you get too clumped together, the Mortars and Sand Goblins and like the Detonates and the Bug Biters can really devastate you. However, with the Obsidian Dwarves, I've made many a time the mistake of using my normal gate placements and placing them in a spot where Balzar can get between both of them and 2 spaces away from both of them, and then I lose all my gates and a Volcanic Blast, and that creates a lot of open space, a new zone per se. It's not a good time.
The next two, we got the Shadow Elves and Wayfarers. Shadow Elves, I'd say, are largely a zoning thing. They can just play the long game, and they create, again, kind of similar to Obsidian Dwarves or some other ones, they create areas that your opponent doesn't want to go into. Because, like, you have to always be worried about glinting speed. You have to be worried about Shadow Pulse and other things that can just take you out. But when it really comes to crowding, I think the really only trick they've got is, like, being able to feint onto your opponent's gate after attacking, or feint, that kind of thing with the Seekers. Yeah. What do you think about Shadow Elves?
Yeah, I think they are very much a zoning faction. They can create such negative space with the feint from the Seekers, pulling units, bouncing them back with Cylinder's ability, different aspects of reformatting their gates with like the darkness, and they have tons of abilities that allow them to create that negative space and make them very hard to approach, creating very tough zones. And they have some good ranged units to back it up. The Seeker being maybe their best ranged unit, even though it's not technically a ranged unit because of its feint ability. That 3 melee at ranged hits hard.
When we get to the Wayfarers, like I was saying, I think they do a mix of both. They're probably one of the best factions at stealing spaces, which is a crowding thing. I've seen like Bookish play Wayfarers very differently than I do, because I'm often known for just going straight for the enemy summoner and trying to take them out. But he'll play the game a bit longer and slowly just like choke and like surround enemy gates, eventually get a pin, and then finish you off,
Play it a more of a cave goblin way.
Yeah, kind of more the way I was talking about with cave goblins, where, I mean, obviously it's a little dangerous against factions like sand goblins and polar dwarves and stuff like that. You might still just have to play around the edges and just chip at their summoner. I do think they have a zoning aspect just in terms of like things like Gusto, Slip By, your Astral Waypoints, Test. Like they can just affect so much of the board, but from further back, so I think they have a lot of tools in that regard too. We haven't talked at all about the High Elves tonight, but the High Elves and Swamp Orcs are our next two in this kind of review.
The High Elves,
they're zoners too. But
yeah, they can zone everything. Dictate is such a great zoning ability. They can crowd a little bit too, but normally you don't want to crowd as the High Elves. I mean, Bean uses it very well and has done to great success in like the Live League.
Like with Titus and stuff.
Yeah. For the most part, because of the way the auras work, you don't want to crowd with the High Elves because then you'll be giving benefits to your opponents also.
I guess Justice is like the counterpoint, the Arbiter of Justice. Yeah.
Yep, Justice can be the counter to that. But Valeria has that ability to press up with Dictate and do that crowding, or just zone with Dictate. Sometimes people will use zoning abilities just like her attacking your own gate to bring a unit back to create more negative space after it attacked with a ranged attack, creating it even harder to approach. They have a lot of ways to make it very hard to approach. And when you do approach, you hit a piece. So it's just very tough.
Space that's not habitable to you.
Yep.
Also, there's also Oblige, which just changes the board a lot too, in terms of what's safe or what's not safe, or kind of much like Muster, which we haven't gotten to yet. But
Mm-hmm.
and then the Swamp Orcs, yeah, I'd probably push them more in the zoning side as well. Similar to like maybe the Obsidian Dwarves, in that, because like their range units are garbage for the most part. You're not going to be like winning. You're not going to be winning a game shooting them with Bog Shamans. A little bit like the Breakers, they can affect the board with Vine Mancers and pull things into their zone and just clobber them with Muglug.
Yeah, Vine Mancers can be super strong in that way. Vine Mancers can also be super strong just zoning by pulling Muglug back. I played Devlin in the Tournament of Champions and against another zoning faction in Skyspear Avians, and Devlin was very much playing a keep away, and at one point described it as like a cage match because we were both rocking forward just a little bit just to get an attack in, and then I would pull back like 2 spaces with Vine Mancers, or Devlin would Gathering Song back. And so it was very much a push a little into the fight and then get out to the back of the cage to try and not get hit.
Yeah. All right. So the next factions, I think we might actually have some factions that do some crowding in the Mountain Vargath and the Crimson Order. At least the Mountain Vargath, they're a very versatile faction, I think, in terms of the way you play them. And the zoning and crowding aspects are no different there, because they like to get up with the opponent's gates, and they create situations where your opponent doesn't want to get next to them either, with stuff like the Brutes. You can do a lot of crowding when space dealing with things like Varn, your Brutes, and other forcing abilities. So I'd say they have a good mix of both. But I know you play them more than I do, probably.
Yeah, the Vargath they do have a good mix. They have, like you said, with Varn or like Martial Forces, where they can really can do either or. Like they can pull things back and like create negative space in zones that they want the opponent to approach through, or like different lanes they want the opponent to approach through. Or they can, if they're being aggressive with it, they can be up and like use it to block off spaces against gates or around the summoners, use it to protect Sunderved, or get it behind the opponent's summoner or a unit of stuff of that nature. They do have a lot of aspects to really do both. And part of the problem is when they start crowding you is they have such high health and they can hit pretty hard that you got to deal with them quickly, otherwise you're going to get overrun fast.
And I was reminded of something I want to talk about with Cave Goblins, but also here with the ramming advance and just that charge ability in general. The fact that that's actually more of a zoning ability, even though it gets units next to you. The idea is like you need the movement, or you need the area to get that ramming speed. So sometimes even with Cave Goblins or the Mountain Vargath, you might have a gate further back, so you can kind of threaten an area with ramming advance.
And Stronghold can be both a zoning and a crowding event. People don't use it to crowd as often as they use it to zone, I feel like, but you very much, if you place like a gate,
like diagonal to your opponent's gate.
Diagonal to your opponent's gate, you can then crowd that gate.
With an end of turn stronghold. I think it's an underused technique, but it's definitely there. Yeah, and then next up, Crimson Order. Like I was saying, I think similar to Sarah, they kind of create zones of like their little killing area with like priests and Baron Daemar. But at the same time, they have so many little zero cost guys that just get in the way. And I think they can be used, especially since you can, if you wanted to, you could like end of turn place another one in front of Daemar, theoretically crowd and at least just try to create more areas where your opponent can't move as much. And I think maybe the aggressive Daemar is maybe a little underused, or the aggressive board control version of the Crimson Order is something people could look into too.
I've seen people, and I've used it a little bit myself that way, but I've seen people use it that way also. It can, depending on the faction you're playing against, get you in trouble because Daemar is often lower health and is lower health by the turn normally because of the abilities you're using to like keep up momentum. But if done right and against certain factions, you could really use those different aspects. You can also use Convert to like take spaces around gates or units that you want, and that can really give you advantages for crowding. But in general, I think they're more of a zoning faction, and it's much like the vanguards, you want to create, like you said, those killing zones. And you can do that a little bit by crowding also. Like if you get in the front of their gate, then they have to approach from the sides, which give you options to attack with Daymar to then continue to like take out those units. So often I will not fully crowd out the opponent, but I'll try and like keep the spot in front of their gate to make them approach from the sides to give me more options to shoot at with Daymar and stuff like that.
So who was that? So the Deepwood Groaks and the Forged. I think Deepwood Groaks are like probably another big zoning faction, just in terms of like they got Seers, right? That just creates huge swaths of the map where you can't move commons freely without just getting nickeled and dimed, and things like Poison Potion, Wither Potion. They're just about kind of slowing you down and making your movement and your life difficult in that way. And they got Swift Potion that can be used to run up and attack things, but can also be used to a hit and run, probably more often than not.
Yep, definitely can. It can be used both ways, but probably works a little better to zone than it does. And even their like wardens help zone with the protect. They don't have as many tools to crowd as they do to zone. They have a lot of zoning tools.
But on the other side, we've got the Forged, which might be one of the most prevalent crowding factions around in their ability to build diagonally to their summoner and just get in there. And then I guess you might say, in a way, sentries are kind of a zoning unit because they just create unit spaces you can't go. But I don't know.
I think sentries are definitely a zoning unit. I think magcogs are a bit of both. They can be used to zone, and they can also be used to crowd. Like magcogs can be used to take space on crucial points after you destroy something by going next to one of your other units or structures, and then but they can also get rid of that space by hopping behind your bigger units and structures, taking away and making that space more negative space that they have approached through, and then getting forged in flames when they do. Man, can the inventor crowd you out. You'll blink and he'll be in your back row just building structures, and you'll be like, when did you get here?
Yeah, and you got to be very careful about leaving low health things because they can be forged in flames and then even have more spaces stolen. Probably one of the best factions at stealing spaces and getting in your way. What's the next two? We got the Storm Goblins and Shimmersea Fae. I'd say, Shimmersea Fae want a crowd too.
Unless you're a beast, then they're zoning faction.
Hang back with Inara and just nickel and dime them over and over again by repeatedly summoning her and using scouts. I think, they can go both ways, but I think the way they feel written is to be a crowding faction.
Yeah, for sure. And I think they lean towards crowding a bit more with like the scouts abilities and
like Tidebreakers being able to come in and take up space after being summoned in the attack phase, stuff like that.
Yeah, I feel like the Storm Goblins are more zoning than they are crowding, though. They can do a little crowding, and they have that aspect, but I feel like, man, can they zone you out with their discharges and grounded?
There may be kind of like the way mirroring the cloaks in that they use the zone to maybe try to get a pin later. I've seen it sometimes where like I'm playing against somebody and I'm actually glad that they used the electric charge to free me up. Like they just pin my summoner.
They're like, I didn't have anything to counter that, and then they shocked me, and now I'm free.
So maybe that's something you could look into with Storm Goblins, is just occasionally let yourself pin the opponent summoner and let your little Vold Swapper stay there for a turn.
Yeah, please do it against Fungal Dwarves.
Now we're on the wave 5, the current wave.
Grove and Filth.
The Grove and Filth. The Grove are weird because like they can't move, so they just kind of get crowded, but they're good at.
Yeah.
They're just kind of good at controlling that space themselves with their own.
Well, they have like Shove and Protect, and they have
or the Autumn Shroud.
They have Autumn Shroud. They have Uproot, which are all good. But I was thinking of the Swamp unit. The Seed Bearer allows you to pull units to certain areas, which allows you to like create those zones. And Stag Rider can do a bit of zoning too, and the fact that you can get off cheeky attacks and then hop back to very safe spots. I feel like people don't use Seed Bearer enough. I don't see the Vine Grab used as much as I feel like it probably should be, but it can be very strong to pull things into spaces that are just much more advantageous for you to attack them.
Yeah. The only tricky thing is they don't make their own boosts, so you got to get them off of events or being summoned from Nimid.
Yeah, very true. Adric's kind of a zoning too.
Yeah, because you basically have to hit him or don't attack for a while. And I think just the fact that you can't move your summoner to advance makes it difficult to crowd people. Maybe the saplings could be thought of a crowding unit, but I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen them be more aggressive and crowd a little bit, but it's not to the full extent. It works some if the tree gets some early uproots and can move up a bit. Or if you went through your deck fast enough, you could probably crowd, get a 20 health tree coming at you full speed, with a Seasons and Bear out next to it or something like that. Ascurial has played a bit more of an aggressive tree and had some of those games against me in which they were getting very up close and personal.
And now I'm trying to think about the Filth. They got a lot of zero cost guys that can potentially block gates, especially with things like Shield the Hopeful. You can just be annoying and be tough to cut through those guys, and then
they're the one-man crowder with the Abomination. You can't stop him. He'll come and find you.
They try to create a zone similar to the Fungal Dwarves of like, here's my area, my happy spot where I want to be, like having people come to me and kill my units so I can keep getting boosts.
Yeah, I think they're more of a zoning faction, and they do some zoning with some of their mutants, like Horror does some zoning, Bursting does some zoning, even Spew can do some zoning aspects. And then they have zoning events like Hopeful and Horrify, which really prevent different aspects of where you can get off good attacks or get off attacks at all and really force you to certain areas. So I think they're definitely overall much more of a zoning faction. They do have a bit of aggression with like Zeal, and they can get some crowding up there in that aspect with if you get a aggressive Demagogue and an Abomination, it can be hard to avoid, especially if your summoner is low health. But that's more hunting you down than it really is crowding. It's more just an assassination.
Yeah, who we got next? Isle Vekid.
And the Spectral Conclave.
Spectral Conclave. I think we already talked a bit about Spectral Conclave. They're actually a very good crowding faction and zoning. They're all about controlling space one way or another, I think. Whether they put stuff in the way or they just make you not want to move next to them. They're just one of those factions that's frustrating to play against because they control space so much better than most factions.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And man, are they so good at controlling that space, especially against melee units. You don't have a rebuttal, really. But I think Isle Vekid are much like more, not one-sided, but they're more, I feel like, of a zoning faction than they are. Even in like some of their champions, people use Watui very aggressively, but that's I feel like almost like a Balzar type zone of, hey, what's in this area? What can get destroyed? It's almost creates a different offensive zone that you're trying to avoid.
Similarly for like Plunge, just creates like it extends reach and makes you more scared of being in certain areas.
Yeah, and with like Tempo and like Fluid, you can really create those different like negative spaces and make it hard for them to approach you, get back into areas that it's hard for them to have a lot of choices on their turn.
So I don't know if we did a tally, but it definitely seems like there's more zoning factions than crowding factions.
It does indeed.
I didn't think about that going into it, but I guess it could depend somewhat on the definitions themselves or just the way Summoner Wars seems to play out, and that it seems to favor hanging back and being more defensive overall, but doesn't mean that's the only way to play. And crowding, as I said, it's not just about blocking gates, it can also be about blocking units or even protecting yourself through crowding your own things with stuff.
I feel like it's about 10 factions to, what do we got, 28? 10 to 18? 10 crowding, 18 zoning?
Yeah, and there were a number that we said were kind of do a bit of both, so it's not all one or the other. There's a lot of factions I think are pretty dynamic in the way they can be played and the way they want to control space, either by hanging back and using it negatively or crowding and taking up the space.
For sure.
Overall, I think it's been a good discussion just to open up an avenue of describing play instead of just talking about, what cards are strong, what cards are bad, should we discard them? I think it's good to look at the positional aspect of the game too.
Yeah, and the positional aspect plays such a big part. I mean, people have written entire articles just on gate placement, and in a similar aspect, that how to move your units and how to create the zones and when to crowd and stuff of that nature. We don't have the time to get into the nitty-gritty with every single faction and like when to do each, but those aspects are a huge part of the game. So I think it's important that we discuss them. I appreciate you guys listening, and this has been another episode of Discard for Magic. We'll see you guys in a couple weeks.